In the heart of the 12th century, the sands of the Middle East were drenched not only with sunlight but with blood. Kingdoms rose and fell beneath the relentless desert sky. Crusader fortresses dotted the hills like jagged teeth biting into the land, and banners bearing the cross of Europe clashed with those of the Crescent. It was an age of conquest, faith, and fire, and amid the chaos a legend was about to be born. A man whose name would echo through centuries as a symbol of honor, justice, and mercy. His name was Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. He was not born into power. He was not born a warrior. He was born into a family of Kurdish heritage in the city of Tikrit on a cold night in 1137. His father, Ayyub, served as an officer under the Zengid dynasty, loyal to Nur ad-Din, one of the great Muslim leaders of his time. From his earliest days, Saladin was surrounded not by wealth or luxury but by duty, faith, and the quiet dignity of discipline. Even as a child, there was something different about him. He preferred books to blades. While other boys trained in archery and horseback combat, Saladin would spend hours with scholars, studying philosophy, the Quran, and the histories of past empires. His mind was sharp, his memory astounding, and his heart deeply devoted to justice. But destiny has a way of calling even the reluctant. When Nur ad-Din's armies clashed with Crusader knights near Damascus, Saladin joined his uncle Shirkuh in the military campaign. It was there, amid the dust and cries of battle, that the young scholar first tasted war. He saw not only the brutality of men but the fragility of life and the power of unity under faith. At first he was quiet and reserved, not the fierce commander history would one day remember. But those who fought beside him began to notice a quiet strength. Saladin never boasted, never wavered, never lost control. His courage was measured, his resolve unbreakable. When victory came, he did not celebrate with arrogance, he gave thanks to God. Years passed and Saladin rose through the ranks, guided by his uncle Shirkuh's mentorship. When they were sent to Egypt to aid the Fatimid Caliphate, few could have predicted that this mission would change the course of history. Egypt at that time was torn by internal division, its leaders weak, its people weary of corruption. Saladin, with his humility and discipline, quickly earned respect. He reorganized the army, stabilized the region, and brought order to chaos. When Shirkuh suddenly died in 1169, many expected Egypt to fall apart again. Instead, the people, soldiers, scholars, and nobles alike, turned to Saladin. At only 31 years old, he became vizier of Egypt, one of the most powerful positions in the Islamic world. But power did not change him. He continued to live simply, refusing luxury, eating what his soldiers ate, sleeping little, working tirelessly. He began rebuilding Egypt not for personal glory but for a higher cause, the unity of the Muslim world. In Cairo, he established schools, hospitals, and new systems of justice. He lowered taxes, ended corruption, and ensured that even the poorest could seek protection under his rule. The people began to see in him not merely a leader, but a righteous man, a reflection of the prophet's virtues in a time of darkness. But across the Mediterranean, the Crusader kings watched with unease. They saw Egypt strengthening, uniting with Syria, and they realized a terrible truth. If the Muslim lands united under one banner, their own strongholds in the Holy Land would crumble. And so they began to plot, and Saladin began to prepare. The desert had found its lion, but the storm was only beginning. The golden sun burned over Cairo, casting its light upon a city reborn. The markets bustled once more. Children laughed in the narrow alleys and caravans flowed through the desert gates. Egypt, once fractured and bleeding, was now alive again under the steady hand of Saladin. Yet even as life returned to the land, whispers of war echoed in every corner. The Crusader kingdoms, fearful of this rising power in the east, began to conspire. From Jerusalem to Tripoli, from the citadels of the Templars to the courts of Europe, letters were sent, alliances renewed. They all spoke of one man, Salah ad-Din, the upstart who dared to unite the Islamic world. But Saladin was not interested in power for its own sake. He had a vision, a dream greater than thrones or crowns. He sought to bring peace and unity among his people, to end the endless wars that drained the strength of the Muslim lands. To him, the Crusaders were not merely enemies of faith. They were reminders of what disunity had cost his people. And so he began his work in silence, forging bonds where once there had been walls. He reached out to the rulers of Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul, offering them friendship, faith, and a shared purpose. Some rejected him out of jealousy or fear. Others saw in him the light of a new age, but Saladin was patient. He believed time and righteousness would win what swords could not. Still, not everyone shared his restraint. The Crusaders struck first. In the spring of 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem launched a sudden campaign into Egypt, led by King Baldwin IV, the young monarch stricken with leprosy, known as the Leper King. His generals believed Saladin was unprepared. They sought to capture Cairo and crush the new power before it grew too strong. Saladin, learning of their advance, moved swiftly. He gathered his army and rode out across the burning sands, his banner of the crescent moon glinting in the sun. Yet fate had other plans. Near the small town of Montgisard, Saladin's forces were ambushed by the Crusaders. The battle was brutal and chaotic. His army scattered, many of his men slain. For the first time, Saladin faced defeat. But from that humiliation came wisdom. He realized that the path to victory would not come from numbers alone, but from unity, discipline, and faith. As he retreated to Cairo, he reorganized his forces, strengthened his alliances, and swore that such a failure would never happen again. For months he trained his soldiers, not just in combat, but in purpose. "We fight," he told them, "not for conquest, not for vengeance, but for God, for peace, and for the honor of our people." And slowly that message began to ignite hearts. By 1179, Saladin had recovered his strength. He led campaigns through Palestine and Syria, reclaiming fortresses and territories once lost. The Crusaders soon discovered that the man they thought broken was now unstoppable. Meanwhile, the people of Egypt and Syria began to whisper his name with reverence. To them, he was not a conqueror, but a guardian, the defender of Islam and the restorer of justice. But even as his fame spread, Saladin remained humble. He wore no crown, refused grand titles, and continued to live with simplicity. At night, he would sit alone under the stars, reading poetry or praying. His advisors often found him sleeping on the floor of his tent, wrapped in a plain cloak despite having the riches of Cairo at his command. He was a man of both intellect and faith, a warrior who believed that mercy was not weakness but strength. And that belief would soon be tested more than ever before. In 1183, as tensions grew between the Crusader states and his newly united Muslim territories, Saladin began preparing for what he knew was inevitable: a holy war, not of aggression, but of liberation. He did not speak of hatred, he spoke of justice. For in his eyes, Jerusalem was not just a city of stone. It was the heart of the world, the bridge between heaven and earth, and no people could truly rest while it remained under foreign rule. The desert wind carried his words far and wide, and across the Muslim lands men began to gather under his banner. Warriors, scholars, peasants, nobles. The crescent and star once again shone over an army united not by greed but by faith. And as the sun set over the golden dunes, Saladin looked toward the west, toward Jerusalem, and whispered the vow that would define his life. "By the will of God, I will not rest until Al-Quds is free." The lion of the desert had risen, and the world was about to tremble. The year was 1187. The sun rose red over the sands of Palestine, burning like a silent omen. The winds whispered through the dry plains and the winds of destiny. For more than a decade, Saladin had prepared for this moment. The Muslim world, long divided by pride and blood, now stood under one banner, his banner. From Cairo to Damascus, from Mosul to Aleppo, warriors and scholars alike spoke his name with reverence. In the streets of Jerusalem, the Crusaders whispered it with fear. The kingdom of Jerusalem, once powerful, was now rotten from within. Its kings quarreled, its lords schemed. The great leaders of the First Crusade were long gone. In their place stood men like Guy de Lusignan, a weak and jealous monarch, and Raynald de Chatillon, a brutal warlord whose arrogance would awaken the wrath of the desert. Raynald had broken every truce Saladin offered. He raided caravans, murdered pilgrims, and even tried to attack Mecca itself, the holiest of cities. When word reached Saladin, his calm eyes turned cold as steel. "He has called upon war," Saladin said softly. "Let him taste it." It began in the early summer of 1187. Saladin gathered a mighty host, more than 30,000 men, the greatest army the East had seen since the days of the Prophet. Their banners of green and white fluttered like waves across the horizon. But this was no army of conquest. Before the march began, Saladin commanded his imams to walk through the ranks, reminding every soldier of their purpose, not for blood, not for plunder, but for faith and justice. Then beneath the blazing sun they rode north toward Tiberias. The Crusaders under Guy de Lusignan gathered their own army, proud knights in heavy armor shining under the desert light. Yet their pride would be their downfall. Against the advice of his generals, King Guy led his army deep into the desert, chasing Saladin across the burning plains. Saladin smiled. It was exactly what he wanted. The heat grew unbearable. The Crusaders marched with little water, their armor scorching, their throats cracked. When they reached the hills near a place called Hattin, they found themselves surrounded. On the morning of July 4th, 1187, the day that would decide the fate of Jerusalem, the Muslim horns sounded across the valley. Saladin's army encircled the Crusaders, their banners shimmering through the haze. Arrows rained down like storms. The dry grass burned and smoke choked the knights. The Crusaders fought bravely, their banners of the cross defiant against the wind, but the fire and thirst were stronger. By noon, their lines broke. King Guy was captured. The Templar Grand Master fell. Thousands were slain or taken prisoner. Only a few escaped the inferno of Hattin. The invincible Crusader army had been annihilated. Saladin stood on a hill watching the field of ashes. His victory was absolute, but what followed would reveal the true measure of the man. Among the prisoners was Reynald de Chatillon, the man who had insulted his faith and attacked innocent pilgrims. The guards brought him before Saladin. "You have broken every oath," Saladin said quietly. "You have defiled the name of God." Reynald sneered, unrepentant. Saladin offered him water, a sign of mercy. But when Reynald reached for it, Saladin stopped him. "It is not for you," he said. "You have no honor." Then with his own hand, Saladin struck him down, not out of rage, but out of justice. The other prisoners were spared. Even King Guy, trembling before him, was treated with dignity. Such was Saladin's nature, firm but merciful. To him, power was not license for cruelty, but a test of virtue. When word of the victory spread across the Muslim world, mosques echoed with prayers of gratitude. Poets compared him to the great heroes of old. Yet Saladin himself wept when he prayed that night, for he knew that every victory carried a burden, and the greatest trial was yet to come. For beyond the burning hills of Hattin lay the holy city itself, Jerusalem, the dream of his life. As his army advanced, cities and fortresses surrendered without a fight. The Crusaders, broken and scattered, could not resist. Within 2 months, the walls of Jerusalem rose before him, gleaming white in the desert sun. The defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, knew they were hopelessly outnumbered, yet they fought bravely. For 10 days, the siege raged. Arrows darkened the sky, catapults thundered, and prayers echoed from both sides. Finally, on October 2, 1187, the gates opened. But what the world expected, a massacre, never came. Saladin entered Jerusalem not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He forbade revenge, protected the Christian holy sites, and offered safe passage to civilians and monks. Women and children were spared. Churches were left standing. The world was astonished. Even his enemies called him a man of honor among infidels. Where others would have written their names in blood, Saladin wrote his in mercy. And so on that day, the crescent once again rose over the city of David. The echo of the call to prayer filled the streets for the first time in nearly a century. Saladin stood upon the Mount of Olives, gazing at the golden dome of the rock. Tears filled his eyes. "Praise be to God," he whispered. "The dream is fulfilled." But as the sun set over Jerusalem, he also knew the war was not over. For in the west, the kings of Europe had heard the news, and soon they would come. When the banners of the cross fell over Jerusalem in 1187, the world trembled. In the west, church bells tolled in grief. Pope Urban III is said to have died from shock upon hearing the news. Europe, humiliated and enraged, rose like a wounded beast. Kings who had long been enemies suddenly stood united. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, 3 of the most powerful rulers of the age, took up the cross. It was the beginning of the Third Crusade. Saladin knew what was coming. He had faced knights and kings before, but never an army like this, one forged by vengeance and faith, guided by men who believed they were chosen by God to reclaim the holy city. Yet Saladin did not panic. He strengthened his alliances, rebuilt fortresses, and prepared his armies. He prayed not for victory, but for patience. War is not always won by the sword, he told his generals. Sometimes it is won by the heart that refuses to hate. In 1189, the Crusaders arrived in waves. First, the Germans under Barbarossa. But fate struck early. While crossing a river in Asia Minor, the emperor drowned. His mighty army dissolved into chaos. Only a few reached the Holy Land. Then came the French and English fleets, sailing through the Mediterranean like thunder. Richard Plantagenet, known as Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, was unlike any king Saladin had faced. He was a warrior, fierce and brilliant in battle, yet also impulsive, ruled as much by pride as by courage. When he landed in the Levant, his campaign began with fire. The city of Acre had been under siege for nearly 2 years. The Crusaders, exhausted, begged for help, and Richard delivered it with devastating precision. From the sea, his catapults hurled massive stones that shattered the city's walls. From the land, his knights advanced in perfect formation, shields gleaming beneath the sun. The Muslims inside Acre fought valiantly, but the balance had shifted. After weeks of relentless assault, the garrison surrendered. Saladin, who had watched from the hills, agreed to a truce. The prisoners would be released in exchange for the Holy Cross and a ransom. But the negotiations dragged on. Mistrust grew. Then, in one of the darkest moments of the Crusades, Richard lost patience. He ordered the execution of over 2,700 Muslim captives, among them women and children. When the news reached Saladin, his heart sank. He did not curse Richard. He simply closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. "May God judge between us." But make no mistake, the Lion of the Desert was not broken. His resolve hardened. His commanders, men like his brother al-Adil and his general Taqi al-Din, rallied their forces. The next great clash came at Arsuf, near the Mediterranean coast. The morning of September 7th, 1191 began with silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Saladin's cavalry waited in the dunes, their horses restless. Richard's army marched along the coast, shields raised, banners fluttering. Then Saladin struck. His horsemen charged like thunder, arrows darkening the sky. The Crusader ranks held firm, a wall of steel and discipline. For hours, the desert shook with the sound of battle. Finally, when Richard saw an opening, he gave the signal. The knights of the crusade lowered their lances and charged. The collision was cataclysmic. Dust and screams filled the air. When it ended, neither side had truly won. Thousands lay dead, the sands ran red. Richard had proven his valor. Saladin had proven his endurance. As the sun set, Richard sent word to Saladin. "You showed the courage of 10 men today." And Saladin replied, "And you, the pride of 10 kings." In a war born of faith, the two greatest warriors had found something rarer than victory: mutual respect. For months after Arsuf, the war continued in stalemates and negotiations. Richard could not take Jerusalem. Saladin could not destroy Richard. Each man knew that continued fighting would only bring more death. So through envoys and letters, they sought peace. At last, in September 1192, the two lions agreed. The Treaty of Ramla ended the Third Crusade. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed safe passage to the Holy Sepulchre. When Richard fell ill and prepared to return home, Saladin sent him fruit, snow-cooled water, and his own physicians. Their enemies called them foes. History remembers them as equals. When the truce was signed, Saladin rode through Jerusalem once more. He looked upon the city he had fought to protect, not for gold or glory, but for peace. A witness wrote of that moment. He ruled like a king, but lived like a servant of God. The war had scarred his body, but not his soul. He had defeated kings, yet remained humble. He had conquered cities, yet gave away his own wealth. As the winds of the desert blew across the Holy Land, Saladin, the Lion of the Desert, stood not only as a conqueror, but as a symbol of what it truly meant to fight with honor. As the winds of the desert blew across the Holy Land, Saladin, the Lion of the Desert, stood not only as a conqueror, but as a symbol of what it truly meant to fight with honor. His name echoed across continents, carried by travelers, chroniclers, and soldiers who had seen with their own eyes a ruler unlike any other. Even among his enemies, respect for Saladin grew into legend. In the courts of Europe, stories were told of a Muslim sultan who showed mercy when he could have shown cruelty, who upheld his word even in the chaos of war. Knights and kings spoke his name not with hatred but with awe. Richard the Lionheart himself, his greatest rival, had called him a man without equal. But for Saladin, the struggle was never about fame or admiration. It was about something far greater, the unity of the Muslim world. The dream that had driven him since his youth still burned in his heart, to restore dignity to lands divided by greed, and to remind all who followed him that faith without justice was hollow. After the Battle of Hattin and the recapture of Jerusalem, Saladin's empire reached from the Nile to the Euphrates. Yet even at the height of his power, he lived with humility. Chroniclers tell us that his chambers were simple, his meals modest. When he walked among his people, he did not surround himself with luxury or guards. He greeted the poor, he listened to petitions, he forgave those who wronged him. One of his closest companions once said, "Saladin never saw his throne as a seat of privilege, but as a burden of responsibility." And indeed, that sense of duty consumed him until his final days. The wars had left scars, on the land, on his people, and on his body. Yet he refused to rest. He continued to negotiate peace with the Crusaders, ensuring the safety of pilgrims from both sides, allowing Christian and Muslim alike to visit their holy sites without fear. In Damascus, where he eventually made his home, Saladin became a symbol of leadership guided by conscience. He founded schools, hospitals, and places of refuge for travelers. He invested in knowledge, inviting scholars and poets to his court. In the evenings, as the muezzin's call faded over the ancient city, Saladin would sit in quiet contemplation, a warrior who longed not for war, but for a peace that could endure. When illness finally came for him in 1193, it was not in a palace of gold, but in a small, unadorned room. The man who had once commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands possessed so little that, after his death, his attendants found barely enough money to pay for his funeral. Everything he had ever gained he had given away, to his soldiers, to the poor, to the rebuilding of cities shattered by war. As his body was prepared for burial, his standard-bearer walked through the streets of Damascus holding a simple white flag. A herald followed him, calling out, "Behold the great Sultan Saladin, who conquered the east and west, yet takes with him nothing but this shroud." It was a moment that froze time. The conqueror who had once commanded the destiny of nations now returned to the earth with the humility of a servant. The people wept, not only for the loss of a leader but for the passing of an era. Centuries later, when pilgrims stood before his tomb, they would whisper prayers not only in Arabic, but in Latin, French, and English. For even those who had once called him an enemy felt that in Saladin lived something universal, the ideal of chivalry, compassion, and faith intertwined. His legacy became the bridge between worlds that had long been divided. The Lion of the Desert had shown that greatness was not measured by conquest alone, but by the mercy one shows in victory. And as the sun set behind the domes of Damascus, painting the sky in gold and crimson, it was said that the wind carried his spirit once more, across the sands, over the holy cities, beyond the boundaries of empires, whispering a truth that outlived every sword and every crown. Power fades. Glory dies, but honor is eternal. Long after Saladin's body was laid to rest beneath the marble dome of Damascus, his spirit refused to fade into silence. For the centuries that followed, the world would return again and again to his story, seeking perhaps a glimpse of what true nobility looked like in an age consumed by conquest. The chroniclers of both East and West recorded his name with reverence. In Arabic, they called him Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, the righteousness of the faith. In Latin, he became Saladinus, a figure so extraordinary that even his enemies could not help but mythologize him. The minstrels of Europe sang of his grace and courage, transforming him from a distant adversary into a symbol of knightly virtue. And in the Islamic world, he became something greater still, not merely a conqueror, but a moral compass. For rulers and scholars alike, Saladin's reign became a reminder that power must serve justice, and that victory without mercy was a hollow triumph. His example would echo in the corridors of history. Centuries later, when rulers sought to justify wars or defend peace, they would invoke his name. Ottoman sultans called him the model of Islamic leadership. European thinkers described him as the embodiment of chivalry. Even during the Crusades' later retellings, poets and playwrights painted him not as a villain, but as the mirror of virtue itself. One of the most enduring stories told by those who met him came from an English chronicler who wrote, In Saladin's eyes, the Christian was not an enemy to be destroyed, but a soul to be understood. That understanding, born from the deserts of Syria and Egypt, carried through generations. When East and West clashed in later centuries, there were always those who whispered his name as a symbol of reconciliation, proof that compassion could exist even amid war. The tomb of Saladin still stands today in the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. Visitors who enter find two resting places, one of marble, the other of wood. The marble sarcophagus, gifted by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany in the 19th century, remains empty. The true body of Saladin lies in the wooden one, simple, unadorned, unchanged by time. There is a quiet power in that simplicity. It is said that when the French Emperor Napoleon visited his tomb during his Syrian campaign, he bowed his head in silence and whispered, "If only I had lived in your time, great Saladin, I would have made you my friend." And perhaps that is the ultimate testament, that across centuries, across faiths, even those who sought conquest could not help but honor the man who sought justice. In our modern world, a world where ambition often overshadows integrity, the story of Saladin returns like a breath of desert wind. It reminds us that leadership without humanity is tyranny, and that victory without compassion is defeat. He ruled not through fear, but through respect. He fought not to destroy, but to unite. And in that balance, sire, between sword and soul, between duty and mercy, lay the secret of his immortality. Even now, as the muezzin's call rises over the old stones of Damascus and the sun sets over the same sands he once crossed, it is said that the wind still carries his name. A whisper, soft yet eternal. Salah ad-Din, the lion of the desert, the king who conquered hearts. And somewhere beyond the shifting dunes of time, his spirit still rides, Mar, not toward battle, but toward peace. Because for men like Saladin, death is never the end. It is only the beginning of legend.